The sudden proposal came like a storm in the calm of her life. Sophie had always believed in love, but after years of failed relationships, she had grown cynical. Money, power, and the idea of a stable future seemed more important than anything else. She had no idea what she was walking into when her aunt introduced her to Marcus, a man who looked like he had everything: money, charm, and an air of sophistication. He wasn't what she would have called perfect in the traditional sense, but his confidence and status were undeniable. He was wealthy, successful, and had a presence that commanded respect. Marcus wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a wife. When he proposed, it wasn't a declaration of passion, but rather a simple, practical offer. He needed someone to stand by him, to secure a future that would benefit both of them. Sophie was taken aback but intrigued. After all, her dreams of a better life, a more secure future, were becoming more and more distant. She had always hoped for love, but maybe it was time to let that fantasy go. The idea of marrying Marcus wasn't born from emotion, but rather necessity. She agreed, thinking it would be a pragmatic step. A marriage for convenience, where both parties would get what they needed. They would go through the motions, put on a facade of normalcy, and live their separate lives. But Sophie had no idea how wrong she was. The wedding was grand, just like everything about Marcus. The guests were all powerful figures, the setting was luxurious, and the ceremony was exactly what anyone would expect from a man of Marcus's stature. Sophie felt out of place in a world she had never really belonged to, yet she did her best to play the part. As the days turned into weeks, she started to see that Marcus wasn't as indifferent as he had appeared. He was kind, thoughtful, and always made sure she was comfortable. His gestures, while small, spoke volumes. Attention to detail, quiet compliments, and the way he made her feel safe in a world she had never been part of. Sophie found herself conflicted. Was she starting to feel something for him? Was this just the illusion of security clouding her judgment? The realization that she might actually be falling for Marcus was terrifying. She had agreed to this marriage as a means to an end, not expecting anything more. But as she spent more time with him, she began to question her initial decision. Was this a marriage for convenience, or was it something more? The line between what she had once thought was a simple arrangement and something deeper began to blur. The more she got to know him, the more she saw that Marcus had vulnerabilities of his own. Behind the wealth and power was a man who had his own struggles, a man who craved connection and love as much as she did. But Sophie was still uncertain. She had entered this marriage with no expectations of love, and now that it seemed to be growing, she felt confused. The perfect marriage in her mind was one built on security and understanding, not on passion. But as she began to see the warmth in Marcus's eyes when he looked at her, she realized that maybe she had been wrong all along. Sophie had built her life around the idea of security, but now she was beginning to question whether that was enough. Could she truly settle for a marriage of convenience when something deeper, something more real, was slowly blossoming between them? Would Marcus feel the same? Was he capable of loving her, or had he simply wanted a business partner? Someone who would fill the role he needed? As time went on, Sophie realized that the line between business and love was not as clear-cut as she had once thought. The more she tried to push her feelings aside, the more they grew. Sophie found herself thinking about him more, noticing the way his smile made her heart flutter, the way he took care of her without asking for anything in return. She started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could learn to love him, or if she was just fooling herself. As their relationship evolved, the question that lingered in Sophie's mind was simple. Would this marriage stay as it was, practical and emotionless, or would it develop into something more? The tension between them grew with every passing day. Sophie didn't want to get her hopes up, but the connection she felt with Marcus was undeniable. Their marriage, which had started out as a mere transaction, was slowly becoming something more complicated. She couldn't help but wonder, was this a true marriage of convenience, or was love finally starting to blossom in the most unexpected of places? The stakes were high, and Sophie found herself at a crossroads. She had to decide whether to embrace what was slowly growing between them or shut it down before it became something she couldn't control. Was she ready to let her heart lead her? Or was she too afraid of what might happen if she opened herself up to a future with Marcus that wasn't just about security and stability? As Sophie stood at the threshold of this new chapter in her life, she realized that nothing in life was ever truly predictable. What had begun as a practical decision had the potential to turn into something that could change both of their lives forever. The day arrived faster than Sophie had anticipated. The grand hall was decorated with lavish floral arrangements. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the elegantly dressed guests, and the scent of expensive perfume filled the air. To anyone watching, this was the perfect wedding. Two powerful individuals coming together in a union of prestige and fortune. But beneath the surface, it was anything but that. Sophie stood before the mirror in her bridal suite, staring at her reflection, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The white gown was breathtaking, adorned with intricate lace and delicate embroidery, but it felt heavy, like the weight of the decision she had made. She barely knew Marcus, the man she was about to marry, and yet in a few hours, she would be bound to him forever. Her heart pounded as she thought about the vows they would exchange. Words meant to symbolize love and devotion. Yet in their case, it was nothing more than an agreement, a contract sealed with rings and signatures. Outside, guests whispered about the match. Some envied her, assuming she had won the ultimate prize, a life of luxury, security, and power. Others speculated about Marcus's motives, wondering why a man like him would marry someone with no notable background. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that this was not a love story, but a carefully crafted arrangement. The doors swung open, and the music began. Sophie felt her breath hitch as she stepped into the grand ballroom, her arm linked with her uncle's, who was walking her down the aisle. The sea of guests blurred in her vision, her focus solely on Marcus, standing at the altar, looking composed and unreadable. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression calm, yet there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite decipher. Was it regret? A hidden sadness? Or was it simply the same detachment she felt? As she walked towards him, she tried to remind herself why she had agreed to this. It was for stability, for a life free of struggle, for the assurance that she would never have to worry about money again. But as she stood beside him, his presence overwhelming, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The officiant's voice echoed through the hall as the ceremony began. "Do you, Marcus Alistair, take Sophie Munro to be your lawfully wedded wife?" There was a brief pause, a flicker of hesitation so slight that no one but Sophie seemed to notice. Then, with a steady voice, Marcus said, "I do." The words felt final, like a door closing behind her, sealing her fate. "And do you, Sophie Munro, take Marcus Alistair to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her throat tightened. This was it. There was no turning back. With a deep breath, she forced a smile and whispered, "I do." The rings were exchanged, a symbol of a union that neither of them had entered for love. As Marcus slid the band onto her finger, his touch was firm yet distant, as if he too was trying to maintain the illusion of ease. The final words were spoken, and then, the moment Sophie had been dreading arrived. "You may kiss the bride." The room held its breath as Marcus turned to her, his gaze searching hers for a brief second before he leaned in. His lips brushed against hers, light, formal, almost cold. It lasted only a moment, but in that fleeting second, Sophie felt an unfamiliar sensation deep within her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but something else. Uncertainty, doubt, the weight of everything she had just agreed to. The applause was deafening as they walked down the aisle together, their hands loosely intertwined. Smiling for the cameras, posing for pictures, accepting congratulations, it was all part of the performance. The reception was just as extravagant as the ceremony, with endless speeches, toasts, and well wishes from people who didn't even know them. Sophie played her part well, laughing at the right moments, keeping up the act of a blissful bride. But as she looked at Marcus, who remained distant yet polite, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a world she wasn't prepared for. They were married now, husband and wife. Strangers bound together by a promise neither of them truly believed in. And as Sophie sat beside Marcus, her new husband, watching the celebration unfold around them, one question echoed in her mind. What had she just done? The jet was unlike anything Sophie had ever seen. Sleek, luxurious, with plush leather seats and crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. She sat stiffly, glancing at Marcus, who was calmly scrolling through his phone, exuding an air of effortless control. The wedding had been overwhelming, but now, reality was sinking in. She was on her way to an unfamiliar destination with a man she barely knew, officially his wife, yet still feeling like a stranger. The takeoff was smooth, and as the plane soared through the clouds, an eerie silence settled between them. She stole a glance at him, trying to decipher his expression, but he was unreadable as always. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "We'll be landing in Santorini." His voice was even, detached, as if informing her of a business meeting rather than their honeymoon. She nodded, unsure what to say. "Have you been?" She shook her head. "No. You'll like it." That was all he said before returning to his phone, leaving her with 1,000 unanswered questions. Hours later, as they arrived at the private villa, Sophie was left speechless. The estate overlooked the crystal-clear waters of the Aegean Sea, the white stone walls gleaming under the golden sunset. It was the kind of place she had only seen in magazines, breathtakingly beautiful, impossibly luxurious. Servants were already waiting to take their bags, bowing slightly as Marcus passed by, acknowledging them with a slight nod. He was used to this life, moving through it with ease, while Sophie felt like an outsider in her reality. As they stepped inside, the scent of fresh flowers and sea breeze filled the air, but the tension between them remained thick. "Your room is upstairs," Marcus finally said, breaking the silence. Sophie frowned, looking at him. "My room?" His gaze was unreadable. "Yes. I assumed you'd want your own space." The words sent a strange pang through her chest. Of course. This wasn't a real honeymoon. It was a trip for appearances, a necessity after their calculated marriage. There was no love here, no passion, just an arrangement. For some reason, it stung more than she had expected. "Right," she murmured, forcing a smile. "That makes sense." She followed the housekeeper upstairs, her heart feeling heavier with each step. The room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling windows opening to a breathtaking view of the ocean. A king-sized bed sat in the center, decorated with white linen and rose petals, a cruel reminder of what a honeymoon was supposed to be. She sank onto the mattress, exhaling shakily. Was this how her life would be? Sharing a house but living separately? Acting like a couple in public but remaining strangers behind closed doors? The knock on the door startled her. She turned to find Marcus standing there, his expression unreadable. "Dinner's in an hour," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "I'll see you downstairs." And just like that, he was gone. Sophie stared after him, feeling a strange mixture of emotions, confusion, frustration, and something else she couldn't quite place. She had married him for security, for a life free of financial worry. But as she sat there, alone in the most beautiful place she had ever been, she couldn't ignore the gnawing emptiness inside her. Money had given her everything she had ever dreamed of. But why did it feel like she had lost something far greater? Sophie had always known that Marcus was a man of few words, but the more time she spent around him, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the man she had married. His habits were precise, his demeanor controlled, and yet there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when his mask slipped, like the way his jaw tightened at certain phone calls, or how his eyes darkened whenever she asked about his family. He never spoke about his past, never mentioned friends or childhood memories. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air, fully formed, with no roots tying him to the world. One evening, As they sat across from each other at dinner, she decided to push. "Where did you grow up?" she asked, watching him carefully. He barely hesitated before answering. "Europe, mostly." "Mostly?" she pressed. A small smirk tugged at his lips. "My father traveled a lot for business." It was vague, non-committal, and yet something about the way he said it made her stomach twist. She had seen the way people reacted to his name, with a mixture of respect and fear. The whispers that followed him. The guarded way his employees spoke when he entered a room. There was more to Marcus than he let on, but every time she got close to peeling back a layer, he shut down. That night, curiosity got the better of her. While he was out on a late-night call, she found herself wandering through the house, ending up outside his study. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, a large wooden desk sat at the center, covered in neatly stacked files and documents. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, scanning the room. There were no personal photos, no childhood memorabilia, only books, maps, and financial reports. But then, on the edge of the desk, she spotted something unusual, a worn-out leather journal. Her fingers trembled as she flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. It wasn't a business ledger. It was handwritten notes, fragmented sentences in different languages, coded messages. And then she saw it. A name she didn't recognize but was circled in red, underlined multiple times. Before she could read further, the sound of footsteps made her snap the journal shut. She barely had time to put it back before Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Looking for something?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her shiver. "I know. I was just—" She trailed off, knowing no excuse would sound believable. He stepped closer, his gaze locked onto hers, assessing, calculating. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he simply said, "Stay out of my study." There was no anger in his tone, no visible threat, but the warning was clear. That night, as she lay awake in bed, her mind raced with questions. Who exactly had she married? And what secrets was he hiding behind that perfect, controlled facade? Sophie could no longer ignore the gnawing curiosity eating away at her. Every interaction with Marcus felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, and the more she tried to fit them together, the more questions she uncovered. His wealth, his influence, the whispers that followed him wherever they went. Nothing about his life made sense. She needed answers. That evening, she confronted him. "Who are you, really?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Marcus, who had been reviewing some documents in his study, looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're my wife, Sophie. That's all you need to know." But that wasn't enough. "That's not an answer," she said, stepping closer. "I found your journal, the coded messages, the names circled in red. What are you hiding from me?" For a moment, she thought he would deny it, deflect as he always did. But instead, he exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand down his face. "You weren't supposed to find that." His voice was quieter now, almost resigned. "Then tell me," she insisted. Silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. "I'm not just a businessman, Sophie." He looked her in the eye, and she saw something there. Something raw, unguarded. "I was born into a royal family. But not just any royal family. A kingdom hidden from the public eye, protected by power, wealth, and secrecy." Her breath caught in her throat. "A kingdom?" He gave a small nod. "Yes. My real name is not Marcus Hale. It's Prince Marcian of Astaria." The name sent a chill down her spine. Astaria. The name was vaguely familiar, whispered in rare political circles, rumored to be one of the last standing monarchies that controlled vast territories and resources in Europe. But no one knew the full truth, because the royal family had always remained shrouded in mystery. And now, she was married to one of them. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. Because my life is dangerous, Sophie. People would use you against me if they knew who you were. I needed to protect you. By lying to me. She shot back, hurt flashing in her eyes. By making me believe you were just some wealthy businessman. I had no choice, he admitted. Even this marriage, it wasn't just for convenience. It was to protect my identity, to throw people off my trail. Her heart pounded in her chest. So I was just a cover for you? He hesitated, and that pause made her stomach twist painfully. At first, yes. The confession hit her like a slap. She had thought she was stepping into a cold but simple arrangement, a transactional marriage to a rich, mysterious man. But now, she realized she had stepped into something much bigger, much more dangerous. But it's not just that anymore, he added quickly, stepping closer. I never expected to feel anything for you, Sophie. But I do. She wanted to believe him. But how could she? Their entire relationship had been built on deception. I don't know if I can trust you, she admitted, voice trembling. I understand, he said softly. But I need you to know that I will do whatever it takes to make this right. You are my wife, Sophie. And now that you know the truth, you are part of my world. But did she even want to be? Sophie had always imagined that wealth and luxury would make life easier, but she had never felt more lost. Now that she knew the truth about Marcus, Prince Marcian of Astaria, everything around her felt unreal. The grand estate she had thought was just a billionaire's mansion was actually a royal retreat, protected by an elite security force. The formal dinners, the mysterious guests, the whispers in the halls, everything suddenly made sense, but knowing the truth didn't make it any easier to accept. She wasn't just a billionaire's wife anymore. She was married to a prince, part of a world she didn't belong to. And everyone around her made sure she felt it. The staff, who had once been polite but distant, now regarded her with barely concealed judgment. The royal advisors Marcus worked with treated her like an inconvenience, an outsider who didn't deserve to be in their presence. Even at dinner, she felt the weight of their stares as they spoke in a language she didn't understand, discussing matters she wasn't included in. Marcus noticed her discomfort, but he didn't know how to fix it. He had grown up in this world. She hadn't. And no matter how much he tried to make her feel at home, she felt like she was drowning in expectations she couldn't meet. The pressure was suffocating. You don't belong here. The words came from Lady Evelyn, one of Marcus's closest advisors, a woman with cold, calculating eyes. This life isn't for someone like you. You weren't raised for this. Sophie clenched her fists under the grand dining table, her appetite completely gone. I'm his wife, she said firmly. That should be enough. Evelyn smirked. Should it? The people of Astaria will never accept you. They expect a princess who understands royal duties, not some ordinary woman who married into wealth. You're an embarrassment to him. The words stung more than Sophie wanted to admit. She had tried so hard to fit in, to prove that she deserved to be here. But it seemed like no matter what she did, it would never be enough. Later that night, she confronted Marcus. Why didn't you tell me it would be like this? She asked, her voice raw with frustration. I thought the hardest part would be learning to trust you again. But it's not just you, Marcus. It's this entire world. They don't want me here. Marcus exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I knew it wouldn't be easy, he admitted. But I hoped, you'd have time to adjust before the pressure became too much. Time? She scoffed. They're already tearing me apart. Your advisors, your people, your traditions. I don't even know the language they speak. I feel like I'm just existing here, not living. He stepped closer, his expression filled with regret. Sophie, I never wanted you to feel like this. You're my wife. That means something to me. Does it mean something to them? She challenged. Because right now, it feels like I'm nothing but a mistake in their eyes. His jaw tightened. They'll learn to accept you. Will they? She shook her head. Or will I just spend the rest of my life proving myself to people who have already decided I'm not good enough? Marcus had no answer, and that silence told her everything. Maybe she would never belong in his world. Maybe she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Sophie had barely begun to process the weight of being married to a billionaire prince when the pressure from his family started closing in on her like an unrelenting storm. The royal court of Asteria was not just a family. It was an institution, steeped in centuries of tradition, rules, and expectations that left no room for an outsider like her. From the moment Marcus had revealed the truth about his royal status, she had sensed a shift, but nothing could have prepared her for the full force of what was coming. The first real test came at an official royal gathering, an event where she was expected to be introduced formally as the wife of Prince Martian. She had spent hours preparing, wearing a dress chosen by one of the royal stylists, her hair arranged in an elegant updo, makeup applied to perfection. But when she entered the grand ballroom of the palace, all eyes turned to her, and none of them held warmth. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. She's not noble. How can an American commoner be part of our royal family? What was Prince Marcian thinking? The weight of their judgment settled heavily on her chest, but she forced herself to smile, to hold her head high. Marcus, standing by her side, squeezed her hand reassuringly, but even he couldn't silence the disapproval around them. The moment she met Queen Beatrice, Marcus's mother, she knew the real battle had only just begun. The queen was a woman of formidable presence, her icy blue eyes assessing Sophie with barely disguised skepticism. "You are different from what I expected," she said smoothly, though Sophie could hear the underlying criticism. "I hope you understand the responsibilities that come with being a part of this family." "I'm learning," Sophie replied carefully. "I love Marcus, and I want to support him in any way I can." The queen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Love is a fleeting emotion. Duty is eternal. If you truly wish to support him, you must understand that your personal desires are secondary to the needs of the monarchy." The statement chilled Sophie to the core. Was this what her life would be? A constant struggle to fit into a role she had never asked for? The pressure only increased in the days that followed. She was assigned etiquette lessons, language training, even courses on Asteria's history and political structure. Every mistake she made was met with quiet disappointment from the palace staff and disapproval from the queen's closest advisors. "You must learn to address the nobility correctly," Lady Evelyn instructed during one of the lessons. "You bow too casually, you speak too freely. A princess must be poised and controlled at all times." Sophie clenched her teeth but forced herself to nod. She wasn't just being trained, she was being molded into someone else. And the worst part? She didn't know if she could ever become that person. The pressure reached a breaking point when the subject of heirs was brought up. During an intimate royal dinner, Queen Beatrice addressed Marcus directly. "It is time to discuss the future of this family," she said, her gaze flickering briefly to Sophie. "A royal marriage is not just a union between two individuals. It is the continuation of a legacy. The people will expect an heir soon." Sophie nearly choked on her wine. An heir? They had been married for barely a few months, and already she was expected to produce a future ruler. Marcus stiffened beside her. "Mother, this is not a discussion to have at dinner." The queen's expression remained unreadable. "It is a discussion that cannot be avoided. The longer you wait, the more unstable the public's perception of your marriage becomes. A child would solidify Sophie's place in this family." Sophie felt her stomach twist. Was that what it would take for them to accept her? Not her efforts, not her willingness to learn. But a child? She set her fork down, her appetite gone. Later that night, she sat in the royal chambers she shared with Marcus, staring out at the sprawling city below. When he entered, she didn't turn. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Regret what?" "Marrying me. Bringing me into this world." He walked to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. Number never. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Then why does it feel like I have to prove myself every single day just to be here? He exhaled, pulling her close. Because they don't know you like I do. But I promise you, Sophie, you don't have to change for them. She wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew. If she didn't fit into their expectations, she might lose him. And that was a risk she wasn't sure she was willing to take. Sophie had tried her best to adjust to the royal life. But no matter how much she learned, how many lessons she took, or how many traditions she memorized, she still felt like an outsider. The weight of the expectations, the whispered judgments, the constant pressure to be perfect, it was suffocating her. And worst of all, it was starting to put a strain on her relationship with Marcus. The first major conflict between them happened after a high-profile charity gala. Sophie had spent hours preparing, ensuring she looked and acted the part of a perfect princess. She smiled, shook hands, and responded to conversations with the grace and poise expected of her. But beneath the surface, she was exhausted. And when she overheard a conversation between two noblewomen mocking her background, it was the final straw. "She still carries herself like a commoner," one woman whispered. "No matter how much they try to polish her, she'll never truly belong." Sophie clenched her fists, fighting back the urge to respond. Instead, she excused herself and left the event early, retreating to their chambers before Marcus could find her. When he finally returned, she was sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights. "Sophie, what happened?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I can't do this, Marcus." His brows furrowed. "Do what?" "This life, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of never being good enough." Her voice cracked, revealing just how much she had been holding in. "No matter what I do, they'll never accept me." He took a step closer. "Who said something to you?" "It's not just about what they say," she replied, shaking her head. "It's the way they look at me, the way they talk about me when they think I can't hear. I wasn't born into this world, Marcus. I don't belong here." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're my wife, Sophie. That means you do belong." "Does it?" she shot back, her voice rising. "Because sometimes it feels like I'm just here to fill a role, to be molded into someone I'm not. I thought love was enough, but maybe it's not." His expression darkened. "Are you saying you regret marrying me?" She hesitated, and that pause was enough to make his jaw tighten. "I don't regret loving you," she said carefully. "But I do regret walking into this without realizing what it would cost me." Silence filled the room. The weight of her words hung between them like an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to face. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quieter this time. "Sophie, I know this isn't easy, but I need you to trust me. I need you to believe that we can get through this together." She wanted to believe him, but doubt had already crept into her heart. She had sacrificed so much to be with him, but at what point did she start losing herself? Over the next few days, tension lingered between them. Conversations became shorter, their interactions more strained. The love was still there, but the weight of their reality was starting to overshadow it. One night, Sophie found herself wandering through the palace gardens, seeking a moment of solitude. But she wasn't alone for long. Queen Beatrice appeared, her expression unreadable. "You seem troubled," the queen observed. Sophie sighed. "I'm just trying to clear my head." The queen studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Being part of this family is not easy, Sophie. You knew that when you agreed to marry my son." "I knew," Sophie admitted. "But knowing and experiencing it are two different things." The queen nodded. "You are not the first outsider to struggle with this life, and you won't be the last. But let me give you a piece of advice. Strength is not about blending in, it's about standing firm in who you are." Sophie looked at her in surprise. It was the first time the queen had ever offered her something other than criticism. "And what if I'm not strong enough?" The Queen's gaze was unwavering. Then you must decide if love is worth the struggle. That night, Sophie lay awake, replaying the conversation in her mind. She loved Marcus. There was no doubt about that. But was love enough to withstand the pressure, the expectations, the sacrifices? She wasn't sure anymore, and that terrified her more than anything else. Sophie and Marcus had once been inseparable. Their love was supposed to be enough to overcome any obstacle, any challenge. But now, it seemed like the distance between them was growing wider with each passing day. It started with small things. Marcus had become more absorbed in his royal duties, spending long hours away from home, attending meetings, and dealing with the never-ending pressures of the royal family. Sophie tried to fill the void by involving herself in charity work and learning the ins and outs of royal etiquette. But it was never enough. The more she immersed herself in the world of royalty, the more she felt like an outsider. The expectations were suffocating, and the constant scrutiny from the public and the royal court made her question if she would ever truly belong. She had hoped that Marcus would be there to support her, but he seemed to be retreating further into his own world. When they were together, their conversations had become strained, filled with awkward silences. It was as if they were both trying to hold on to something that was slipping through their fingers. Sophie felt like a shadow in her own marriage, always trying to catch up with Marcus, but never quite reaching him. One evening, after a particularly cold dinner, Sophie decided to confront him. She found him in his study, surrounded by papers and reports. "Marcus, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't look up from his work. "Not now, Sophie. I have a lot to do." "I don't care about your work right now," she replied, her frustration building. "I care about us, about our marriage, because it feels like you don't even see me anymore." Finally, he looked up, his expression tired and distant. "What do you want me to say, Sophie?" "I want you to look at me, really look at me, and tell me that you still care, that this marriage still matters to you," she said, her voice breaking. He stood up and walked over to her, but there was no warmth in his touch. "Of course I care, but you have to understand, Sophie. There are bigger things at play here. I'm not just Marcus, your husband. I'm the future king of this country. I have responsibilities that you don't fully comprehend. And I'm supposed to just accept that? That I'm not important anymore? That your duties come before everything? Even me?" she asked, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm trying to do what's best for everyone, including you," he said, his voice growing defensive. "You think it's easy for me, Sophie, but I don't have the luxury of being selfish." "Selfish?" she echoed. "You think it's selfish to want to feel loved? To feel like I'm more than just an accessory in your life? I didn't marry you to be a part of a royal spectacle. I married you because I loved you, Marcus. But now, I'm not even sure if you still love me." He turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I do love you, but you don't understand what I'm going through. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the future of an entire country. And sometimes I wonder if you truly grasp what that means." Sophie's heart sank as she listened to him. She knew he was right. His responsibilities were immense, but so were hers. She had given up everything to be with him, to become part of his world. She had left behind her own dreams, her own life, to support him. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, feeling more alone than ever. "You think I don't understand?" she said quietly. "You think I don't see how hard this is for you? But I'm losing you, Marcus. I'm losing us. And no matter how much I try to be the perfect wife, it's never enough for you, is it?" He didn't answer, and that silence spoke louder than words. It was the silence of two people who had once been in sync but were now drifting apart, lost in their own worlds. The next few days were filled with tension. Every interaction felt forced, every conversation awkward. Sophie spent her days in the palace, attending to royal duties, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. She couldn't focus. She couldn't concentrate. Her mind kept drifting back to the same thought. Was this the end? Was this how their love story would end? She missed the man she had fallen in love with. The one who had looked at her like she was everything. The one who had made her feel special and important. Now it seemed like she was just a footnote in his life. On the other hand, Marcus seemed to be getting more and more consumed by his responsibilities. He barely slept, rarely ate, and was always preoccupied with the future of the monarchy. Sophie understood his dedication, but she couldn't help feeling abandoned. She tried to talk to him again, but every time she opened up, he seemed to close off. She felt like she was drowning in her own emotions, and he was too far away to help her. One evening, as she stood at the window of their room, watching the city lights flicker below, Sophie realized something that both saddened and empowered her. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep holding on to a marriage that seemed to be slipping away. But the thought of letting go terrified her. She loved Marcus. But love alone couldn't fix the distance between them. As she turned to face him, still working at his desk, she made a decision. It wasn't a decision to give up on their marriage, but a decision to fight for herself. To find a way to balance her happiness with her commitment to him. The next morning, Sophie stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in a long time, she didn't see the woman who was trying to fit into a royal mold. She saw a woman who had dreams of her own, who deserved to be loved and cherished. And in that moment, she realized that if she was going to save her marriage, she had to first save herself. It was time to stop pretending, to stop sacrificing who she was for the sake of a life that didn't feel like hers. She didn't know what the future held for her and Marcus, but she knew that she couldn't keep living in the shadow of his royal duties. She needed to find her path, her purpose. Only then would she be able to truly rebuild what they had. The realization hit Sophie hard as she stood at the grand balcony of the palace, gazing out at the city below. The lights shimmered like a million tiny stars scattered across the horizon, but despite the beauty of the view, a sense of emptiness settled in her chest. She had always dreamed of a life with Marcus, full of love and happiness, but the reality of their relationship had become something much more complicated. For so long, she had been caught up in the whirlwind of royalty, in the allure of the grand palace, the attention, the wealth, and the lifestyle that came with being married to a future king. She had convinced herself that this was the life she had always wanted, that love could conquer all. But as the days passed, she felt more like a prisoner than a partner, more like a shadow of the woman she used to be. She had been raised to value love above all else, to believe that true happiness didn't come from material things. Yet here she was, married to a man who had everything she had ever dreamed of: wealth, power, influence, and yet she felt more isolated and alone than ever. The irony wasn't lost on her. Marcus was everything she had ever wanted in a partner, but their love was slipping through her fingers, just as her dreams of a perfect life were starting to fade. She had been blinded by the luxury and the expectations of royalty, believing that if she could just fit in, if she could just play the part of the perfect wife, then everything would fall into place. But it hadn't worked that way. What had once felt like a dream now felt like a gilded cage, a beautiful prison from which she couldn't escape. The realization dawned slowly, but with clarity. Love wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about the grandeur of palaces or the fine clothes she wore. It wasn't about living a life of luxury or basking in the spotlight. No, love was about something deeper. Love was about connection, about being seen and valued for who you were, not for what you could bring to the table. Sophie had spent so much time trying to be the perfect wife in the eyes of the royal family, trying to meet everyone's expectations, that she had forgotten the most important thing: her happiness. She had lost sight of who she was in the process, and now, as she looked out over the city, she realized that it was time to change. She couldn't keep living her life based on the expectations of others. She couldn't keep sacrificing her dreams for the sake of a life that didn't feel like hers. She had to find a way to reconnect with Marcus. But more importantly, she had to reconnect with herself. She had to remember the woman she had been before all the wealth and the titles had come into her life. She had to remember the values she held dear: love, kindness, authenticity, and use them to guide her through this difficult chapter of her life. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew that she couldn't keep ignoring her own needs, her desires. She had to find a way to bridge the gap between her and Marcus, to remind him of the love they had shared before everything had changed. But the biggest realization came when she understood that love wasn't just about what they had in common, or how well they fit into each other's worlds. It was about accepting each other for who they were, flaws and all. She had to stop comparing herself to the royal world and the expectations that came with it. She had to stop trying to be someone she wasn't, someone that others expected her to be. For so long, she had felt like she had to prove herself. To Marcus, to his family, to the people. She had tried to mold herself into someone worthy of the royal crown, but she had lost herself in the process. The thought of standing in front of Marcus and confessing her feelings terrified her, but she knew that it was the only way forward. She had to be honest with him, with herself. She couldn't continue to hide behind the image of the perfect royal wife if it meant sacrificing her own identity and happiness. As Sophie sat down on the balcony, her mind raced with thoughts of how to approach Marcus, how to have the conversation that would change everything. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. She had to find a way to speak from the heart, to tell him that it wasn't about the palace, the wealth, or the titles. It was about the love they had shared, the connection they had once had, and how she longed for that again. She had to remind him of the woman he had married, the woman who wasn't defined by her title or her wealth, but by the love they had shared. It wasn't going to be easy. The pressures of the royal family, the expectations of the people, all of it was weighing heavily on their relationship. But Sophie knew that if they were going to move forward, if they were going to rebuild their love, they had to first confront the reality of what they had become. She couldn't keep living in a world where she felt like she was playing a role. She had to take off the mask and show Marcus the real her. And in doing so, she hoped that he would see the woman he had fallen in love with. The woman who was more than just a princess, more than just a royal wife. She was a woman who wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the title she carried. With a deep breath, Sophie stood up and walked back into the palace, determined to find Marcus and have the conversation that would change everything. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that love, true love, was worth fighting for. The wealth, the status, the grandeur of the palace. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the love they shared, and whether or not they could rediscover it, even in the face of everything that had come between them. It was time to put the past behind them, to stop hiding behind the masks they had worn, and to face each other with open hearts. The realization was clear. Love wasn't about wealth, status, or titles. It was about choosing each other, no matter what. The turning point came for Sophie in the quietest of moments, standing on the edge of the grand balcony, the wind softly brushing her hair. She gazed out at the glittering skyline of the city, the sparkling lights reflecting off the river below. The palace stood proudly in the distance, an opulent reminder of the life she had been thrust into, and yet, it felt more like a cage now than a home. Her marriage to Marcus had started as a fairy tale, a union of convenience, a promise of power, wealth, and security. But as the months went by, Sophie had begun to realize that these things, which once seemed so appealing, had come at a cost. She thought she had everything: a husband who was a future king, an unimaginable life of luxury, a family who expected the best from her. But what she didn't have was the one thing that mattered most: love. Real love. The kind that couldn't be bought or acquired through titles and money. The kind that could only come from genuine connection. Marcus, the man she had once thought would be her everything, had become a stranger to her. The grand palace, with its marble floors and glittering chandeliers, felt empty. The expensive gowns she wore, the lavish dinners and soirees, all of it felt hollow. She had everything that money could buy, but in the process, she had lost herself. What was the point of all this wealth if the one thing she needed, true love, was slipping through her fingers? She had become a figurehead, someone admired from afar but not truly known, not truly loved. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She had been so caught up in the life of royalty, so blinded by the wealth and the grandeur, that she had lost sight of what mattered. Love, the real kind, had been replaced by an empty formality. Her marriage to Marcus had started as a way to secure her future, a means to elevate her family, and a promise to give her everything she had ever dreamed of. But it had slowly morphed into something else. She had thought that love would follow. After all, she was married to a man who could give her everything, who could offer her a life most people could only dream of. But now, as she stood on the balcony, she realized that what she needed wasn't riches or titles. What she needed was a real connection, someone who could look beyond her status and see the person she truly was. Marcus was a good man, but he was also a product of his environment. He had been raised to prioritize wealth, power, and legacy. And for a while, Sophie had convinced herself that these things would be enough to sustain their marriage. But as time passed, the cracks in their relationship began to show. Marcus was distant, consumed by the weight of his responsibilities, his family's expectations, and the demands of being part of the royal family. Sophie had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that everything would be fine as long as they had wealth and status. But now, standing there alone, she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The truth was that she wasn't happy, and neither was Marcus. The turning point came when she realized that she had to make a choice. Continue living a life of luxury and wealth, but with no true emotional connection, or risk everything and choose love, even if it meant giving up the world she had been living in. Her heart tugged at her as she thought about the life she had with Marcus, the moments they had shared, the love they had once had. But she also knew that love couldn't be forced, and it couldn't be built on the foundation of wealth alone. There had to be something deeper. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that the facade they had built for the sake of appearances was enough to sustain their relationship. Sophie had always believed that love was the most important thing in the world. She had come from a humble background, where family and love were everything. And now, as she stood at this crossroads, she realized that her values had never truly changed. The world of royalty and wealth had seduced her, but deep down, she knew that her heart would never find peace unless it was filled with real love. The decision wasn't an easy one. Sophie thought about what she had built, her life in the palace, the respect she had earned, the title she carried. She thought about the promises made and the expectations from both her family and Marcus. It felt like everything was on the line. If she chose love, would she be able to leave the luxury and the world she had come to know? Would she be willing to walk away from the comforts of wealth for something that might not work out? Could she risk it all for the hope of finding true love again? And what about Marcus? What if he didn't understand? What if he couldn't give up the life they had built together? The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew that whatever choice she made would change the course of her life. But she also knew that she couldn't continue living in this emotional limbo. The empty palace, the coldness of their interactions, the life of luxury that felt increasingly like a prison. It was all becoming too much to bear. She had to choose for herself. She had to choose the love she had once shared with Marcus, the love that had seemed to be lost in the chaos of their world. Sophie knew that love was never easy, and it wasn't always the grand gestures or the beautiful settings that made it real. Love was about finding someone who truly saw you for who you were, someone who valued you for your soul and not your title. She wanted to believe that Marcus was that person, but she couldn't keep waiting for things to change on their own. She had to make the change. The decision was clear now. Sophie had to choose love. She had to fight for it, not with wealth or grandeur, but with honesty and vulnerability. She would have to open her heart to Marcus, tell him how she felt, and risk everything for the chance at something real. It was time to take the leap of faith. If love were truly worth fighting for, then this was the moment to do so. She turned from the balcony and walked back inside, determined to find Marcus and have the conversation that would change everything. Sophie didn't know what the future held, but she knew that if she didn't try, she would regret it forever. It was time to choose love over wealth, to choose a future that was built on real emotion and connection, not just titles and riches. The moment had come for Sophie to make the most important decision of her life. Would she risk everything for love? Or would she choose the life of luxury that had, in the end, brought her nothing but loneliness? Only time would tell. But Sophie was ready to make her choice. The grand gesture came at a moment when Sophie had nearly given up on the idea of reconciliation, when the weight of the palace's cold walls felt unbearable, and the emptiness of her marriage had seeped into her very bones. She had spent countless nights alone in their enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she could live without love, that the life she had built with Marcus could still fulfill her needs. But deep down, Sophie knew the truth. She couldn't keep pretending. She had tried to push Marcus away, to distance herself from him, to bury her feelings under the layers of wealth and status. She had wanted to avoid the vulnerability that came with love, especially after everything she had been through. But in that moment, standing alone in the grand halls of the palace, Sophie knew she couldn't continue like this. She had to make a decision, one that was raw, real, and daring. If she wanted to change the course of their marriage, if she wanted to find the love she had once thought was lost, she had to act. The grand gesture was not going to come from Marcus. He was trapped in the same world of expectations, traditions, and pressures. If Sophie wanted something different, something real, she had to take the first step. She thought back to the day they had met, the way they had both been so different, so unaware of what they could become. She thought of the vulnerability they had once shared, the small moments that had hinted at a deeper connection beneath the surface. It was those memories that sparked something inside her, a sense of urgency to break through the walls they had both built around themselves. With a deep breath, Sophie knew what she had to do. She had to reach out. She had to show Marcus that her love wasn't just about the money, the titles, or the royal life they had built together. It was about the person he was, about the connection they had once shared, and about the possibility of something real. Sophie knew the stakes were high. She had already been through so much, emotionally, mentally, and socially. The expectations of the royal family weighed heavily on her, and Marcus had always been a man of duty, of tradition. To reach out for love meant risking everything, her position, her reputation, and even her future. But she had reached a point where the thought of continuing to live without love felt worse than the risk of rejection. As the days passed, Sophie began planning her grand gesture. It wasn't about grandiose displays or theatrical moments. It was about authenticity. She wanted to show Marcus that she had come to understand the true meaning of love, the kind that went beyond wealth and societal expectations. She spent hours in the garden, writing down her thoughts, putting her feelings into words, struggling to find the right balance between vulnerability and strength. She wasn't going to approach Marcus with a speech filled with apologies or grand promises. Instead, she would speak from the heart, telling him how she truly felt. On the day of the gesture, Sophie woke early, the air crisp with the promise of change. She had decided to meet Marcus in the place where they had first shared a quiet moment, a spot in the palace garden that had always held a special meaning for her. It was the spot where they had once spoken of their hopes, their dreams, before the weight of a royal life had taken over. It was a place that had always felt like their secret escape, a place where the pressures of their titles didn't matter. Sophie walked through the garden, the soft crunch of the gravel beneath her feet accompanying her nervous heartbeat. She carried with her a simple bouquet, a symbol of her sincerity and her desire for a fresh start. As she approached the small bench where they had once sat together, she found herself hesitating. What if Marcus didn't feel the same? What if this gesture didn't work? The fear gnawed at her, but she knew she couldn't back down. This was her chance to fight for love, for their future. Marcus was already there, sitting on the bench, his face a mask of exhaustion and uncertainty. He hadn't been himself for so long, and Sophie could see the weight of his responsibilities in his eyes. But she could also see the man she had once married, the man she had fallen in love with before the world had intervened. Sophie took a deep breath and walked over to him. She stood there for a moment, unsure of where to begin. But then, the words came. Not rehearsed or planned, but simple and real. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady but vulnerable. "I've been running from what matters. I've been running from love, from you, and from the truth that I can't deny anymore. I've let the world define who we are, and I've forgotten who we are to each other. But I'm here today, not as a princess or a royal wife, but as a woman who wants to fight for what's real." She knelt in front of him, her hands holding the bouquet close to her chest. "I love you, Marcus. Not because of your title, not because of your wealth, but because of who you are. And I know we've lost so much time, but I'm willing to fight for us, for the chance to rebuild what we had, if you're willing to try too." There was a long pause as Marcus looked at her, his face unreadable. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, every second feeling like an eternity. But then slowly, Marcus's eyes softened. He took a deep breath and reached out to take her hands in his. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been waiting for you to come to this realization. I've been waiting for you to see that I need more than just a wife with a title. I need someone who sees me, who understands me. And I've been afraid too. Afraid of being vulnerable, of showing you how much I care. But I'm here now, and I want to try." The grand gesture had worked. It wasn't the spectacle of royal life, the big event everyone expected, but a simple moment of truth. Sophie had reached out, not with a show of wealth or power, but with her heart. And Marcus, for the first time in a long while, was willing to meet her there. This was the beginning of a new chapter for them. One where love came before wealth, where honesty mattered more than titles. It wasn't going to be easy, but Sophie knew that this was the first step in rebuilding their marriage, in finding the love they both deserved. And as they stood there, hands clasped together, Sophie realized that sometimes the grandest gestures aren't the ones with the most spectacle. They're the ones that come from the deepest parts of the heart. The process of reconciliation between Sophie and Marcus was not an instant one, nor was it something either of them expected to happen overnight. It began with a deep, raw conversation, one that neither of them had anticipated, but that was necessary for any real healing to occur. After Sophie's grand gesture, where she had vulnerably laid bare her feelings for Marcus, the air between them shifted. No longer was there an invisible wall of cold formality between them. It was replaced by the unspoken desire to understand, to rebuild, and to find a way forward together. But the path to reconciliation was not simple, and neither Sophie nor Marcus could simply forget the distance that had grown between them over the months. It was as if their marriage had existed under the shadow of their royal duties, weighed down by obligations and expectations that had nothing to do with who they were as people, as a couple. The realization had struck them both. The life they had been living was not the life they wanted. It was a life dictated by others, by the system, and by the pressures that came with their titles. Sophie knew that to rebuild her relationship with Marcus, she would have to go deeper than just addressing the surface issues. It was about acknowledging the hurt, the betrayal, and the disconnection that had plagued their marriage for so long. It was about looking beyond the external forces and seeing each other not as a princess and a prince, but as two people who had once loved each other deeply and still had the potential to rekindle that love. The first step was to truly listen to one another, to hear the pain and disappointment that had accumulated over time. Sophie listened as Marcus spoke about his struggles, how he had felt trapped by his royal duties, how the weight of his responsibilities had made him distant and emotionally unavailable. He admitted that he had shut Sophie out, not out of malice, but because he had been too focused on what he thought was expected of him as a prince. He apologized for the coldness he had shown her, and for not being the husband she had deserved. In turn, Sophie spoke of her struggles, the emotional isolation she had felt, the overwhelming pressure of her royal position, and how she had tried to find solace in material things, in wealth, when what she truly needed was emotional connection. She admitted that she had pushed Marcus away, believing that she could handle everything on her own, that she didn't need him. But the truth was, she needed him more than ever. And she had to face the reality that she couldn't continue living in denial. They both knew that their marriage had become a facade, a convenient arrangement based on appearances rather than mutual love and respect. But acknowledging this truth was the first step toward rebuilding. They decided to take things slowly, not rushing into any decisions, but instead allowing themselves to reconnect at a deeper level. They started spending more time together, away from the public eye, away from the pressures of their titles. They took walks in the palace gardens, shared meals, and talked, not just about the responsibilities they had as royals, but about their hopes, dreams, and fears. It was during these quiet moments that Sophie and Marcus began to rediscover each other. They found themselves laughing again, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The barriers that had once existed between them began to crumble, brick by brick, as they allowed themselves to be vulnerable with each other, to share their innermost thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. As time passed, the emotional distance between them continued to shrink. Sophie learned to let go of her need for control and perfection, realizing that love was not about keeping up appearances, but about accepting each other's flaws and imperfections. Marcus, on the other hand, learned to embrace vulnerability, understanding that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders alone. The reconciliation was not without its challenges. There were still moments of doubt, moments when Sophie wondered if she had made the right choice, moments when Marcus questioned whether they could truly rebuild what they had lost. But those moments became less frequent as they worked together, as they made the conscious decision to move forward. They began to re-establish trust, one conversation at a time, one action at a time. They knew that it would take time to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, but they were willing to put in the effort. The palace, which had once felt like a cold, imposing structure, began to feel like home again. Sophie and Marcus found solace in each other's presence, and their bond deepened with each passing day. Their relationship was no longer built on titles, wealth, or the expectations of others. It was built on understanding, patience, and mutual respect. They had rediscovered what it meant to love each other for who they were, not for what they represented. As they took their first steps toward a future together, Sophie and Marcus knew that the road ahead would not be without obstacles. There would still be challenges to face, still pressures from the outside world. But they also knew that they had each other. And that was the most important thing. Together, they would rebuild their relationship, one day at a time. Their love story, once fractured, had begun to heal, and it was now stronger than ever before. The new beginning for Sophie and Marcus was not just about starting over. It was about embracing a future that was built on love, understanding, and mutual respect. Their relationship, once tainted by the pressures of royal expectations and personal insecurities, had been reshaped into something deeper, more meaningful. Sophie and Marcus had spent countless hours together, rebuilding the emotional foundation that their marriage had lacked for so long. The royal palace, once a place of cold formality, was now a space filled with warmth, laughter, and shared moments of intimacy. They no longer saw each other as titles or symbols of wealth, but as partners, equals on a journey of healing and growth. Sophie, who had once been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of being a princess, now found herself relieved by the simplicity of their connection. The weight of the world, the royal obligations that had once defined her, were now secondary to the love she shared with Marcus. She realized that love was not about grand gestures or material wealth, but about the small moments, the quiet talks, the shared glances, the quiet understanding between them. Marcus, too, had experienced a shift. No longer burdened by the idea that he had to uphold the expectations of his royal family at all costs, he began to see the world differently. He saw Sophie not just as a princess, but as the woman he had fallen in love with. The woman who had once given him a glimpse of a life filled with love and possibility. With their relationship mended, they were ready to face whatever the future held, together. The love they shared had transcended the materialistic world they once inhabited. They no longer sought validation from wealth, power, or status. Their love had become their source of strength, a driving force that propelled them forward. They decided to take control of their destiny, no longer willing to let external forces dictate their happiness. For Sophie and Marcus, the future was not about continuing the royal legacy. It was about creating their legacy, one that was rooted in love, understanding, and the realization that happiness was not something to be earned, but something to be shared. Together, they envisioned a life that was simple yet profound, where the pressures of their royal status no longer interfered with their ability to love and cherish each other. Sophie began to step back from the public eye, focusing more on causes and charities that were close to her heart, finding fulfillment in giving back and making a tangible impact on the world. Marcus, too, found a new sense of purpose. No longer burdened by the expectations of the royal court, he pursued ventures that aligned with his passions and values, finding joy in projects that focused on creating positive change. They spent more time in the countryside, away from the prying eyes of the media and the expectations of their family. They traveled together, explored new cultures, and made memories that were not defined by royal duties, but by shared experiences. In these quiet moments, Sophie and Marcus realized that their love was enough. They did not need the grandiosity of royalty to feel fulfilled. What mattered was their connection, the bond they had cultivated through their struggles and triumphs. As they continued to grow as individuals and as a couple, their love only deepened. They had become not just husband and wife, but best friends, partners in every sense of the word. They had learned to communicate openly, to support each other through difficult times, and to celebrate each other's successes. Their relationship was no longer perfect, but it was real. It was authentic. They had learned that the key to a successful marriage was not perfection, but effort. They made the choice every day to work through their differences, to be there for each other no matter what life threw their way. Their love story had come full circle. What had once started as a marriage of convenience had transformed into a deep, passionate partnership. It wasn't just about the lavish lifestyle, the royal duties, or the external pressures. It was about love, the kind of love that had survived the test of time, the kind of love that made them both better people. As Sophie and Marcus embraced their new beginning, they knew that they were ready for whatever the future held. They had each other, and that was all they needed. They were no longer bound by the past, but were looking forward to a future of love, growth, and happiness. Together, they had found the true meaning of love, not in wealth, not in titles, but in each other. And as they stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew that their love would always be enough. As Sophie and Marcus stood hand in hand, their love stronger than ever, the question lingered in the air. What would you do? If you were in their shoes, would you have chosen love over wealth? Or would the pressure of status and expectations have been too much to overcome? Would you have been able to look past the glittering allure of royalty, the comforts of a life of luxury, to see the value in something deeper, something more real? For Sophie, the decision to embrace love over everything else had been a long and painful journey. She had spent years trying to live up to the image of the perfect princess, the dutiful royal. But in the end, it wasn't the palace, the money, or the title that had made her happiest. It was the quiet, simple love she shared with Marcus, an ordinary man who had become her partner in every sense. For Marcus, the decision to prioritize love over the expectations of his family and the royal court had been an equally difficult choice. But in the end, it had been the love they shared that had shown him the true meaning of happiness. It hadn't come from wealth or power. It had come from building something real together. Now, as they prepared to embrace their future, they wanted to know, what would you do? If you were in their place, would you have followed your heart? Or would you have let the weight of external pressures shape your destiny? Life often presents us with difficult choices that force us to decide between the easy things, the things that are expected, and the things that truly matter. Sophie and Marcus's journey is a reminder that love isn't about what we have, but about who we have beside us. And sometimes, the greatest challenge is not to choose the path that seems easiest, but to choose the one that feels right for our hearts. Sophie and Marcus's story has inspired so many people to think about their own lives and relationships. It's a reminder that true happiness doesn't come from the things we acquire, but from the connections we build. So, as you reflect on their journey, think about your own life. What would you do in a situation like theirs? Would you follow your heart, or would you let external pressures dictate your decisions? Would you be willing to take the risks, to let go of expectations, and to build a life of love and happiness, even if it meant leaving behind the comforts you once knew? Love isn't always easy, and it isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it's about the quiet moments, the choices we make, and the people we decide to spend our lives with. It's about being true to ourselves and the ones we love. So, as you think about Sophie and Marcus's story, ask yourself, what would you do? What's more important to you? Love or wealth? Expectations or freedom? The life you're expected to live, or the life you truly want to create? The decision is yours, and it can change everything. Remember, true love isn't just about wealth or status. It's about choosing each other, even when things aren't perfect, even when it's difficult. In the end, it's love that makes life worth living.